Welcome to Agribusiness Matters. My name is Venki Ramachandran. Agribusiness Matters is an endeavor to discover systems thinking in food and agriculture in an age of runaway climate change. Today, we have two very special gentlemen who are driving the next evolution of smallholding agriculture. Sriram Bharatam and Rajesh Menon are some of the shining stars in the emerging world of digital public infrastructure. Both carry a very illustrious history. So I'm not really going to do, much of a formal sort of introduction. Rajesh has spent about 17 years in the world of public services and delivering tech to deliver to those services. Sriram is a social entrepreneur, is a serial entrepreneur, and is a Kaufman Fellow, and has come with a very illustrious set of credentials. But I really want to maybe kickstart this conversation with, first of all, thanking you, gentlemen, for agreeing to speak with us at the Agribusiness Matters. And maybe I'll start off with a simple question to maybe I'll start off with Rajesh itself, since he's turned on the audio one and has unmuted himself. Rajesh, how do you describe yourself to your son and the work that you do?
Oh, that's a difficult one to begin with. Uh, I try to keep it simple. I mean, my motivation to be in this line of work has been to be as someone who can uh, be a proponent of change in whatever shape and form it could be, and change that basically results in some degree of widespread impact. Now, impact uh, again fluid in terms of its definition. But what it basically means is impact which results in greater aspirations and better uh, uh, conditions for living and so forth. And also, that's pretty much shaped up my journey over the past many years. It's also allowed me to traverse many sectors because I primarily had this index of what this degree of impact basically meant. And some of my stint in education too was also keeping in mind what my son would go through and so forth. And also everywhere it's basically been the same thing: demystify some of these complex problem statements into something simpler, and how do we make all these resources available as societies and times evolve? How do we make all these resources available for everyone to use? And from that lens, whatever shape and form of our contributions could take shape in, that's pretty much where I've positioned myself. I happen to be in agriculture, biodiversity, and some of the other sectors recently, but I've traversed through many sectors over the past decade and a half. So yeah, that's pretty much. I mean, hopefully, the simplest way to put it, maybe a some kind of a agent of change, maybe, hopefully, if that actually helps. But
Okay.
that's basically what I would uh, call myself. Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. I'll go to Sriram. Sriram, you've had a very long journey, from Hyderabad to now where you are in Africa. How do you define your work, and how do you sort of look back at your work and look at its evolution and where you are right now?
Yeah, so I'm already feeling old going back on the timeline. So, yeah, the journey started off, to be very honest. I mean, my wife and daughter started writing a book on me, and the title of the book is A Restless Monk. And people around me usually say you are restless, and the restlessness is not about frustration, all of that is about trying and managing or trying to see a change. The monk kind of a thing is come with a lot of age and experiencing that you got to accept the fact that you can't really bring a systems change overnight. And yeah, as much as you want to do it, but it's not. So for me, I think I call it as a divine intervention. I don't think I really planned what I'm doing today. It all happened. So I was traveling with an ASCOM delegation late 2010 to Africa, and thanks to Kenya Airways, I missed my connecting flight to Nigeria and ended up spending a day in Nairobi. And yeah, I think thanks to Kenya Airways, my first investor on the continent, they gave me a visa and accommodation. But more importantly, managed to move around, saw the power of how the mobile money, as I'm sure most of you have heard about this thing called M-Pesa, how it has really democratized. This is late 2010, right? September 2010. I saw a common person on the ground using mobile. Today, I know it is ubiquitous in India, the QR codes and all of that, but that's something I saw. And the digital entrepreneur in me woke up saying, oh, if you have the last mile payment fulfillment already happening here, and we actually had a real 3G network working in Kenya, to be precise. And for me, I said, okay, now you have both sides of the world here. And what it takes is to think through what are the pathways to drive systems change. And one thing led to the other. And I told my wife and daughter that I'm coming back in a week's time. And this is my 15th year. I live on the continent now. And the learnings from India actually helped me to understand the continent. It's no different. If we really take a higher view, they both look like cousin sisters, India and Africa. So looks similar, and you just squeeze and then put the same amount of population. That's it. So every state in India is like a country on the continent. And I try to simplify, not get overwhelmed. And with that kind of simplistic mindset, and then said, okay, what if we make this change, what happens? So that's the kind of thinking that drove us to where we are here today. And I'm sure I'm more than happy to share deeper learnings and insights as we continue this conversation, Venki.
Very interesting. Thank you. What is very interesting in parallel is also, a very anchored sense of linking it with impact. And you talked about the step aspect of change, right? Rajesh, how did this germ of idea of this driving with DPI? Because see, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast, as I was mentioning earlier, prior to our, while we started, was, we all have. I was largely a spectator to this change and this shift that was happening in, and I'm right now really approaching this as just as an individual who is just exploring this and watching this from the distance, and having seen this from a distance. Now, as I started getting more deeper into this world, I started asking more deeper questions, and I started also critically examining some of these fundamental propositions. Right. So, to me, this conversation is an attempt to really revisit a lot of the fundamental propositions in the light of today's world. Right. Because in today's world, the way it shows up is in very different shapes and forms. And so one oftentimes wonders what exactly is the fundamental proposition. So I want to go back to your times and when you went from ENY to from there when you moved to Ego Foundation. Was that the first time when you sort of focused on getting into building DPI and DPGs? What was like the original genesis of that change? And could you sort of give a sense of how this entire thesis actually began about?
Oh yeah, I mean, from that lens, I mean, my stint with DPA also was kind of like unplanned. The first half of my career, I was primarily in the private sector. So I spent time in the States too. I was doing health tech over there. I pretty much traversed most of the country. And I had this thing that I wanted to get a sense of how the public sector works. And that's when I was back in India and so forth and all. And I happened to join EY again with some of the colleagues who are now part of the same societal ecosystem, and did join their team. And and my motivation was simple. Like, I mean, having seen one part of the world and one side of the system as such, what would the journey be like when we look to solve for public systems at population scale? I wanted to get a sense of what that basically meant. So even in EY, my entire index was on public systems. I mean, largely began with public health, and my stint started off with tuberculosis. So it was an extremely difficult problem to get into in the first place, and it gave me a shock of my life from, I mean, me having to do health tech in nice fancy places to doing creating frugal innovations for people at large in the most remotest of places, as well as where the resources are, I mean, scarce at best, like Dharavi in Mumbai and etc., where the systems are broken, processes are broken, discipline wasn't there. So yeah, it did intimidate me at the beginning, but then it also provided a sense of like an opportunity to learn like how could we all of this basically meant like from my past experience of building systems and not necessarily engaging with the user communities per se when I was a product engineer and so forth and all, versus this where my entire index fell on communities, gave me a different learning experience altogether. And that's when I started embracing more of what DPI meant. I mean, it wasn't called DPI then, like 10, 12 years ago. But then I started observing closely what Aadhaar's journey was, what some of the other initiatives around the India stack, like DigiLocker and so forth, as to what they could do. I started applying some of them into my own missions in health and so forth when I did tuberculosis, malaria, and so forth and all. And during that stint in itself, so I most of the time that I actually spent in EY, public health was the start, but then given my own interest in Aadhaar and so forth, I started moving into identity and social protection, even within EY, and then started engaging with the same set of people who were building Aadhaar, who were propagating Aadhaar, like with the funding institutions like World Bank and so forth. The idea of the Aadhaar model started getting propagated in several countries. So I got a taste of implementing some of them also, designing for them, implementing for them, costing for them, etc., etc. That was my interest, and it also gives me a sense of how we could construct these kind of national scale efforts by keeping every systemic actor in place, right? It wasn't just the markets or the governments alone, but even civil society, framing of laws like regulations, legislation, and so forth, uh, solving for governance which had to be cooperative in nature, multi-party in nature, and all of that. So that experience of designing for many of these things, such complex systems and complex responses, with trying to address every piece of the puzzle and not just worrying about the software or the tech backbone alone, that prepped me up and got me more and more egged onto what DPI could do, right? Slowly but steadily, after some time, that framing started emerging, and I personally led some initiatives myself, even within eGov and prior to eGov and post eGov and so forth and on. So I did get to see the journey of how we moved from identity to payments to then national stacks in several sectors. My own stint in COVID vaccination around the world, and then eventually moving into open protocols and networks. So that evolution and that exciting landscape, and how a lot of those efforts which then scaled up to population scale, some of those efforts that we germinated led to uh, millions of adopting users across the country and so forth. And through that effort, change on the ground was primarily the reason why uh, I I got a sense that maybe digital public infrastructure as the foundational backbone for these kind of national scale efforts is a good strategy to index against, right? And then you can bring in the power of all partners, including the markets and the government, as well as civil society and several academia, for instance, to contribute in their meaningful ways. All we needed to find was that magic sauce as to how do we get all of them together to contribute, where there's no hierarchy as such. Everybody has a role to play. Clear definition of what those roles and articulation of those responsibilities could be was the necessary ingredients for this to work. But if well orchestrated, these missions have the capacity to solve at an unprecedented population level imagination. That experience is basically what hooked me on to this, and those learnings have we been trying to apply not just in India but in other regions of the world as well. And slowly but steadily, we've starting to figure out that if you have the building blocks for these kind of national scale ambitions, then using a framework like DPI and the building blocks at hand, there is a way to solve this. It's not the secret to solving everything. It needs careful calibration and curation by every actor, but still there is a potential pathway for many of us to work together and make this work. So I'll get into details on more of what
Sure.
this, but this was largely my motivation and my own experience with this journey.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to dig into the calibration and the curation parts more detail. But before that, I want to get into Sriram. Sriram, when we earlier chatted, you were talking about your journey with, today in India, the agriculture entrepreneur or the village level entrepreneur, as we are commonly known, is a sort of a unit of cooperative entity, like in a certain sense, where it's a backbone of Indian agriculture in many ways, right? And but until very recently, we only saw that most of the agri-tech platforms started jumping onto that bandwagon. So given that kind of prominence there, I would love to hear from you. When you started your journey in India, right? You were saying that you took some of your learnings from India and then took and applied them in the case of Kusa, which from the recent data that I saw, which has gone past 5,000 agripreneurs, in its network there. So could you maybe go back to the original genesis of what was it like actually, building some of these agriculture entrepreneur networks in Syngenta Foundation, and maybe, what are the lessons that sort of help you see that maybe there is a possibility of building this as a network per se?
Yeah, so great question, Venki. So in fact, it's the other way around. Kuza in Swahili means grow and biashara is business. So when we created or when we conceptualized and set a mission for Kuza Biashara, we said with the entrepreneurship at the core, we can bring a systems change. The domino effect, as we all speak, you need to have some human trusted agent at the last mile. So the first 5 years of Kuza journey is where we actually experimented quite a bit across 11 countries on the continent, doing different programs, including refugee camps, all the way to the urban slums to rural areas, not specifically on food sector, but at large. And that's the experience where we brought to India and collaboratively working with the Syngenta Foundation and other mission aligned partners like Transform Rural India Foundation, Pradhan, and others, Tata Trust and others. What we realized is you need to have a trusted agent at the last mile. Now, it all started off by asking a very fundamental question as what is available in abundance in the rural areas. A lot of unemployed rural youth. Second, we have a lot of smallholder farmers who are all in the vicious cycle of trying to get the quality inputs and reaching the market and losing 30-40% for post-harvest losses. And third is public spaces or community spaces. So as systems thinkers, when we saw all of this, we said, is there a way we can solve these kind of problems at a lowest atomic level, at a village level? By seeding these young people, putting them through a structured orientation or incubation kind of a program, get them ready. Get them ready to start looking at it not from the producer point of view, but look at it as a livelihood opportunity. And how we went about doing this is we conceptualized and created something called READY, Rural Entrepreneur Development Incubators. So then we started defining the process. Number one is how do you even go about selecting and identifying them? And as we started figuring that out by working with the community leaders, community-based organizations and all of that, second is to how do we put them through a structured incubation? So we not only equip them with the technical advisory information, which is science-based, knowing that they are probably high school or at max some basic education, how do we empower these people so that they can power the communities with the science-based knowledge? So the challenge that we were trying to crack was democratizing this science-based knowledge. And then equipping them with a set of toolkits so that each one, if they can support, say, about 10 odd groups, then there is a good economic activity happening. So that's the broad thesis. And it wasn't easy. That's where I think working closely with the governments, we worked a lot very closely with Jivika in Bihar, Umaid in Maharashtra. These are the state rural livelihood missions, and SERP in Andhra Pradesh. Looking at the community resource people, and we realized that about the same Pareto is applicable there. Some 15-20% of them are enterprising in nature, thoroughly curating and then selecting them, putting them through structured incubation. And then we apply the science of micro learning here. We ruthlessly went about curating and creating bite-sized learning content in videos in local languages and dialects on every topic of interest for a value chain, across a value chain. For example, if you take tomato value chain, how do I go about land preparation? How do you do identify certified seeds? This is most essential information, but that kind of granular information is not available in a curated form. So looking back, we curated over 10,000 plus videos across 42 different value chains, both from, crops to livestock and all of them in 10 different languages. And then we came out with some technology. This is pre-geo era, right? So when you do not, there was no internet penetration in India. And also we were trying to do this, we wanted to fail quickly and fail forward. So India gave us that opportunity for us to try in different contexts. Then we came out with some portable backpacks where using some edge computing technology, some micro projection devices, we could empower these young people. So we actually brought in the concept of mass customization. If I'm a rural youth in this particular village in, say, Bihar, and I'm only interested in livestock farmers and, say, tomato farmers, for example, I should be able to have access to that. And I need to have some technical backstopping support so that I'm able to engage 10 groups of farmers. And then 200 farmers is a good micro, it's about more than $200,000 to $50,000 economy. Assuming even they're producing $3 per day, that's a decent economy for this young person in the rural area to operate. So with that genesis and thinking is when we started mobilizing public actors, philanthropy actors, and most importantly, private sector actors. And it took us close to 4 or 5 years to figure this out. And Rajesh spoke about this magic sauce. We realized that the glue that kind of binds everybody's interest, ranging from service providers and off-takers to credit providers to the local governments, is you need some trusted advisor on the last point. So the agripreneurs, the youth agripreneurs, and agripreneur is actually a play of words, agriculture entrepreneurs, and basically village-based entrepreneurs. By giving them the status, by giving them the social status, most importantly. And a lot of this is, again, learned from Shiv Kumar of, E. Chaupal. We worked very closely with him, understood those learnings. So it's a curation and culmination of very many efforts done by different actors. But we said, is there a commercial self-sustaining model that could be brought to the table? And creating and aligning the interests of all the ecosystem actors and creating a public philanthropy private. And then came the imagination that what if we are able to capture this value in a platform? Then you are unlocking the value for every stakeholder on the platform so that they now are able to leverage and get the value that they need. So that's really the genesis, and that took us close to 1.5 million farmers now with over 6,000 agripreneurs across 7 countries between South Asia and East Africa. And we believe we just started.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for adding the accretive elements there so that, we could see that how things have flowed in and created this structure as you sort of envisaged it. Rajesh, what is very interesting about this conversation is at one level, you're talking more about the process, whereas, the what and the how of it, whereas Sriram is more focusing on the who of it, right, in terms of the actor per se. And so it's very interesting for me to also look at both your stances from which you are responding to the questions here, right? In your videos, you talk about this aspect of DPI-led approach, sufficiently imagined with AI, something like that. You keep repeating that part as an approach per se, right?
Yeah.
And very funnily enough, today when there are a series of variables, adjectives that we typically tend to use when we say DPI-led approach, right? We say decentralized, we say domain neutral, we then say add another phrase called peer-to-peer. So I would love to really maybe get your perspective on how are you sort of defining this this DPI-led approach, if you were to really succinctly bring in the thesis, and how would you sort of go into it? Because each of these terminologies and to me, when I look at unpack these as approach, each of these terminologies right now seems like it's just about to be further disrupted further. It's like almost like the ship of moving parts, right? The Theseus philosophy where each part is now moving in. So what exactly is the philosophy? So yeah, maybe would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an evolving thesis too. The whole point of calling it DPI or digital public infrastructure is essentially to say that how do you create some kind of a foundational layer at, from a tech-centric point of view? You create some kind of a foundational layer so that you can bring in meaningful participation from the private sector as well as the public sector, so that through their imaginations or the systems or the platforms that they bring, riding on this digital highway per se, or the foundational layer, you're able to acquire most of the consumers and most of the merchants or the suppliers and generate value for them. So that's basically the simplest way of explaining DPI. And to do that, there is a bunch of building blocks. Building blocks in the sense it's thematically what it basically means is when you try to create such mega ecosystems, right, riding on some foundational layers, and then the enabling building blocks for getting the private sector platforms, the public sector platforms, and so forth and all. You need to solve for many things. You need to solve for identity of the actors and the institutions or the organizations involved. You need to solve for trust. Every interaction within this ecosystem has to be a trustworthy interaction. Otherwise, people will not participate. You need to solve for access. Ultimately, the idea of such ecosystems coming through is to widen the net of access for everyone, right? Access to goods, supplies, knowledge, anything. But you widen the access. You need to solve for ownership of your own data as well. Like you participating in an ecosystem shouldn't mean that your data is being willfully used by somebody else, right? How do you create some kind of consented ownership of this data streams also, and so forth? And while you define these guardrails well, and then construct the ecosystem, then there is enough meaningful, uh, we call it like transactability experience possible within such ecosystems, right? Because you're bringing every actor, and once you have actors coming through and actors opening up their wares or the catalogs and so forth, transactions are likely to happen. This is like any marketplace scenario. The only difference being the marketplace isn't controlled by one single entity. The marketplace is basically a public asset, right? So this is not some of those large e-com players where you have like one single custodian managing both sides. This is basically a public asset operating like a digital highway, bringing ecosystems together under some guardrails, and then doing all of these things together, right? From that lens, there are several building blocks that add value to this DPI imagination. Like I said, there is a foundational layer, then there is a transactional layer, and then there is probably a user and contextualization or personalization layer, right? And several building blocks under each. Foundational layer is more about solving for things like identity and a degree of trust and so forth and all, or consent and things like that. Irrespective of any domain, any sector, you need these kind of foundational components, right? Transaction is very sector specific, and transactions is kind of where you allow for these decentralized network of ecosystem partners to come through. The objective being buyers and sellers or seekers and providers find ways to discover each other and let transactions happen. Transactions will result in greater economic activity, which in result will also have downstream effects like better livelihoods and value creation at the last mile and so forth and all. And a third layer at the top, which is now being augmented with the experience of AI, is on the personalization front, right? So for all the DPI efforts that we had to do in the last 10, 15 years, it was still difficult to some degree penetrate the last mile and get them to be active users of some of these platforms, because a lot of that is dependent on behavior, right? You can't have like smart devices in the hand of in the hands of many in rural India. They're just not comfortable, maybe using devices, not used to, and so forth. And also, we went ahead with traditional channels then, like call centers and so forth and all. But now, at least with the advent of AI, there is a degree of confidence that through, if not through a touch-based interface, through a voice-based engagement, there is a likelihood that anybody, even in the rural scenario in India, would be able to engage with the larger system per se. So the personalization front of such DPI, mega DPI ecosystems are looking to embrace AI so that they can cut down the barriers of language and experience and so forth, digital divide and so forth and all. That's pretty much what AI also brings in. But that being said, intelligence in the hand of the user uh, is kind of a scenario where I spoke about earlier about careful curation and so forth, because you don't want that piece of tech to be. Uh, I mean, at the end of the day, if the person on the ground doesn't trust that piece of tech, the value is misplaced, right? Which is why it's important to also bring in the trusted agent at the last mile argument that Sri spoke about, right? So if you have AI, for instance, in the hands of the trusted agent at the last mile, uh, and then through that, you are doing a massive outreach to a lot of these communities or beneficiaries on the ground, AI can bring in exponential value, right? So those are some of the arguments and the proof concepts that we are trying to imagine through these DPI efforts. There are several private sector partners co-working with many of us to bring these things to light. And also at the same time, even some of these new age tech, like whether it's at the transaction layer with networks or AI in the personalization layer, they're also learning as we engage with a much larger, wider cohort of consumer behavior and so forth and all. So, but in a broad sense, this is how DPI imagination can be looked at from a lens of from a techno-legal lens. Yes, you need to back all of this. Like I said, this is like a nice jigsaw puzzle or a nice Lego building block. To make all of this work together, you need the right policies, regulations, governance models, and so forth and all. So that's a separate argument altogether. But from a tech imagination, this is what the layered view of a DPI ecosystem would look like.
Fascinating. Thank you. I think this image of putting together with the guardrails certain these jigsaw puzzles really makes sense, because in a way what we are also saying is that only when all of these come together, then we can orchestrate this entire thing here. I want to maybe bring this to Sriram from the more from an entrepreneur kind of a hat there. I was talking to this entrepreneur friend of mine. Uh, and I've been sort of, he's been also aware of what is happening in the DPI world. And he told me this interesting point that, he said, look, Venki, I'm very bearish about DPIs in agriculture. And he tells me this reason that, if everything becomes fungible, right? And when everything becomes fungible, one loses the objective of creating mega companies, you know. And if nobody can make a monopoly or a duopoly, there is so much of fragmentation that you actually kill the spirit of the enterprise. And I found it a very interesting argument he was making in. I would love to hear Rajesh's thoughts on this later. But before that, as a private entity, there is this whole, we have built a certain myth around monopoly. And, as entrepreneurs, like, we come from, the Peter Thiel's world of, you build businesses to go on to become that monopoly and that kind of a space, right? So coming from an entrepreneur lens, how do you see the role of private players in this kind of ecosystem? Because right, we are really adding more guardrails to it and then playing within these specific rules, right? So do you kind of somewhere feel that the spirit of private enterprise, that kind of this daring nature of you wanting to go past and go past with no boundaries and limits, do you see this kind of spirit being trampled a little bit in this world?
Yeah, so Vicky, yes and no. Simply because, see, there are different ways of doing this. So yes, capitalistic thinking, entrepreneurship and private sector is usually associated with, okay, I'm the winner, let me just get everything. Versus, I personally believe there's a different way of looking at it. And the different way is using business as a force for good. Now, there is this global movement happening around B Corporation. Benefit Corporation is a new age category of companies who are companies, but with a social motive. So ask Kuza, when we started off on our journey, I mean, it's very easy to become a non-profit and do that. But there is a fourth sector that we always believed, which seemingly non-existent. It's not public, it's not philanthropy, it's not private sector. Somebody who's operating across all of this. And that's the fourth sector. If there is a name to it, I don't know if it is. If not, let's call it the fourth sector, where we as a business should have a choice to, again, by the way, we need to have choice at every level. Every ecosystem actor need to have a choice and an agency. And that's the reason why we are creating this trusted relationship. And Rajesh eloquently spoke about this entire layering and then the structuring of it. But fundamentally, what I heard him not say or say is trust is a currency on which this entire Lego blocks are built. The day the trust is gone, you don't have anything, everything collapses. So, Sanjeev, thanks for the thumbs up. So good to see you.
I just want to come in. I'll tell you why. I'm sorry for coming in late. I'll tell you why. So I'm in the middle of prepping for my younger son's wedding. So even to get in a 10-minute window is difficult. So Venki, I've been wanting to, but not joining. So my apologies. The reason of trust why I said yes was when I was building eChopal 4.0, which is now rechristened as ITC Mars, all that I told people is that we are building a pipeline of trust with the farmers. That's all that we're doing. Mm-hmm. And once you build that trust, in that pipeline, you could perhaps send anything that you want once that is done. So trust is the currency. So carry on, Sriram. Nice hearing you. Carry on.
Absolutely, Sanjeev. And again, thanks to mentors like Sanjeev and Shiv Kumar. I mean, that's really the inspiration. A lot of people say, how do you get this kind of confidence? I mean, it's a brute confidence, rather. And the belief system that the new age unicorn, a $1 billion enterprise, can actually be the one solving the problem for 1 billion people. And you don't necessarily need to make hundreds and thousands of dollars. $1 per person is good enough for you to even become a unicorn there. And that's a belief system. And for us to be able to achieve that, you got to build these kind of structures and systems. So let me try and unlock this across the framework that Rajesh has just spoken.
So hi, Rajesh, I've not met you before, so I just thought I'll say hi to you.
Yeah. So Sanjeev, your energy is infectious, by the way, and I keep telling this to you every time we meet. We have a catch up. So going back to this, we've actually taken a small sandpit and without really keeping the logos and egos out. The reason why we are doing all of this in Kenya is because it's a relatively smaller, it's probably a small state in India, 50 million population. But what we managed to do is to systematically orchestrate this, working closely with the World Bank as part of this Disruptive Agriculture Technologies Initiative, again championed by a dear mentor and a friend now, Dr. Parmesh. This journey started off in 2018, actually 2018 October, when we met. I did a brown bag lunch with Parmesh in DC office of the World Bank. And then when he realized that I now live and operate out of Kenya, he said, can we do something in Kenya? And what we did is leveraging two of the programs of the World Bank then, there were already 1 million farmers already grouped into common interest groups, vulnerable marginalized groups, and few FPOs being federated out of them. They were existing. So all we had to do was to leverage that infrastructure existing, that's a public infrastructure, and then see how can we now start bringing a set of AgTechs. Look at an acquisition cost of a farmer today. In Kenya, it's a little over $30 to do one-time profile of a farmer. And you and I know, Venki, it's not sufficient. We got to be consistently doing this. So you need to have the guardrails to get this data continuously. So where we are today, cutting the long story short, this is, I think, already 6th or 7th year now. We now managed to influence the national policy to profile the entire population of farmers in the country. 6.55 million farmers in the country are profiled. And who did this profiling? These young people in the rural areas, agripreneurs. They don't see the big picture, but they see a small incentive because I go do this, I get this. Fantastic, good starting point. Now, all the agro dealers are already profiled. So you already have like 15,000 input service providers there. Now, 10% of the of this farmer base is now getting profiled for the soil analysis. Now, with other AgTechs, we are now able to get the data for the climate and the market information. That's, for me, is a foundational layer that Rajesh spoke. Identity, and now you have the registries. Now, we also managed to influence the national government to have a pluralistic extension policy. Not only public sector, even civil society and private sector can do extension as long as you are within those norms. Fantastic. Then institutionalization. So one of the public institution called Kenya Agriculture Livestock Research Organization has put up their hand, and now World Bank has invested and put a digital infrastructure there. Now that is the infrastructure now we are anchoring and then say, can this now be a Kenya-based one network that can bring in all the ecosystem actors together? And then the work that we have done painfully working with multiple development partners over the years, we have little over 3,000 agripreneurs only in Kenya right now, across 95% of the country, has demonstrated that this is doable. That's more like spraying and praying, but we got the insights. The president of the country went ahead and did a big bold announcement saying that we are institutionalizing last mile extension through agripreneurs, youth agripreneurs. So the estimate is minimum 20,000 of them coming in. Now we are rallying and bringing all the development partners saying, don't just go and do sporadic, just put all your energies into one effort. So what is achieved so far? If I step back, institutionalizing last mile, institutionalizing data and then data-driven thing, we're still not there. Again, this is where we are working very closely with Rajeesh and team, and now the Open Ag Network, and all these kind of initiatives are only come to amplify this. And now the next piece is, how do we institutionalize the entire suppliers and service providers? And the big tent and gorilla flywheel is already started spinning. We started by creating a new cadre called agripreneurs. More agripreneurs means more farmers. More farmers means more service providers. And more service providers means more choices given to farmers now again. And better pricing, and the whole thing that we have seen in eChopal and other initiatives happening. But the imagination is, why should it be controlled or operated by one enterprise? What if this becomes a digital public good or a digital public infrastructure, to be precise? Now, we as a private company, going back to the entrepreneurial journey, we said, do I want to raise tons and tons of capital and take interest of my shareholders and then make them grow rich, versus what if we only take a single like 2%, 3% margin for facilitating all of this and have the entire population on this guardrails or this infrastructure? You can still, I mean, as an entrepreneur, you can still make money and do good and think good and create jobs and create livelihoods. So that's a journey, right? So
yeah,
we don't know how we'll go, but it's getting there.
No, thank you. Thank you for going down to detail and getting into specifics around what does it take to institutionalize last mile data, and then now the larger part is supply chain, right? Which connects back to, I would love to hear more from Rajeesh in terms of this whole question around private, right? Because even if we look at in India, the amount of our history of digital public infrastructure in the context of agri, right? There was a time when this idea paper was released in 21, right? And in that time, I had actually written there in my analysis in my newsletter that there was a time when we all wanted Microsoft and Amazon into the agriculture. I mean, everybody was scared, right? And so now then there was this need to create this alternative where the private players were not at all visible in the whole picture, right? There was always there's always talk about keeping the private players away and then thereby creating a non-profit entity, which is sort of more like a bottom-up, right? But in what ways, like for the point which Sriram is talking about is one, when it reaches a certain scale, then the institution of supply chain kind of kicks in, right? So, and therefore we reach at a very funny paradox for trust, right? Like the trust happens only when at the final stage, when all of a sudden things are rolling together. So at early stage, therefore, it becomes a very difficult proposition for agri companies or any agri businesses to kind of invest in and trust, because then there's always a question of, will I be able to call the shots in there? So how do you sort of deal with this challenge, Rajeesh? How are you seeing this?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't claim to say that we have all the answers in, but that's precisely falls under the bucket of this cooperative governance models that we have painfully tried to curate in such DPI efforts. See, the entire argument of DPI, or I mean, through the newer imagination of open decentralized networks, is to widen the pie, right? Successful companies, big companies doing better I don't think anybody has a conflict with that. All we basically effectively wanted that the market is sufficiently big enough to accommodate a much wider segment. How do we also empower local entrepreneurship? What kind of conditions can we create for them to also come to the fore? Can they have a launch pad so that they don't necessarily have to invest in all those painstaking foundational investments, right? Like building the tech layer for a new entity where, and then the registration, onboarding customers, that's like significant chunk of any new startup business, right? So is there a way to cut through all those layers and get to a point quickly where they can actually start transactions, start businesses, right? That's so which is effectively the argument that we've been trying to make, that through this national, I mean, this kind of a digital highway, you find a way to widen the net. You find a way to accommodate more partners into the mix. They could be big and small. Uh, Businesses could realistically think of this being as some government-led way of leveling the playing field and so forth. It actually isn't. Uh, it it's maybe some bias against some specific roles that certain institutions have managed to play in the past many years, but it can be circumvented by this cooperative governance that I spoke about. But once you have this, at least in some of the open network efforts that we are doing in India right now, the governance structure involves representation from the private sector right from the very beginning. And often a lot of these network efforts in now in India or emerging in India are not really government led. They're basically private sector led. It is that the government has a role to play, and government also becomes the custodian of certain assets within that infrastructure. Like say for instance in health and maybe a few other sectors, the government is in some way is seen as the trusted custodian of the veracity of a particular professional's claim, that who said I am a doctor, right? So it has the institutional backing to actually say, yes, I've attested this. It is part of the national register. And now that the national register is there, the register can be part of this larger infrastructure, and businesses can, refer to the register before they onboard a particular professional into their net supplier network and so forth and on. Right. So governments have a role to play. They are also part of the governance structure as such. Some of these network efforts have these boards where there is representation for the private sector voice to be articulated very well. Like in the case of ONDC in India right now, there are specific councils like the user council, which represents the voice of the private the sector. There is another council for the industry bodies and so forth. All of them are fed into this common steering group. And the steering group, which is not necessarily chaired by the government per se, but where government is also a partner. So with these kind of models, we are actually starting to see that the private sector have the necessary autonomy and freedom to operate from day one. And while they also see benefit articulation visible to them. See, the first half of the DPI journey from Aadhaar was different because we had to first build the foundational layers for the country as such, right? And these were largely government subjects, right? Even the payment infrastructure, because it had to be a regulated instrument. So these kind of infrastructure instruments needed that initial push from the government. But what we are seeing in India right now is a wave of commercially led networks coming into the fore, because the whole point is, because we have the foundational layers, let's now start to expand the economic layers to through digital. And that's effectively what we are trying to see. So this is basically the India experience there. I mean, maybe some of the specific sectoral experiences haven't been that great or open enough for the private sector, but at least the mood in the newer initiatives is that the private sector is going to be the key driver of such efforts. And the government is taking a backseat. The few efforts that I'm personally driving, the government is actually actively taking a backseat and letting the private sector run. But the idea of the guardrails, right? You still have a check and balance system into the fray. The idea of guardrails, which is those are precisely areas where the government can actually play a role as well. Policy making can be combinatorial.
Yeah, I mean, that's where probably this idea of who gives the authentication or the veracity of the data. Like for instance, people, many times people ask me this question of, will AgriStack coming in, will it act as a veracity of will it sort of validate the every data that is there underpinning transaction, or what will the role of an AgriStack would look like, right? Would it just be sort of an entity that would coexist? Because there is always these sort of questions that are coming in whenever a diversity of approaches are coming in, right? You also have a ONDC, you have an AgriStack, who are all coming in from very different angles. And so there is always this question of, how they all, it's so easy to say Triveni Sangam pe aajao and you can come in and do for the, but in this world, for people to envisage the convergence is always a very difficult problem. I guess we lost Rajesh from his power, I guess. Yeah, hopefully he should join in.
Yeah, I think I think there's a power failure at his end.
Yeah. So Sriram, while we wait for Rajesh to come in, one question I would like to ask is, traditionally, I've in this time I've spent in agribusiness there, we always wanted to stay away from government, right? Because government doesn't pay you on time, and there is always a question of government, you still always farther at an arm's length distance. That they have the massive scale and all of that, but you try and keep things at a distance there. So how is that approach? Is that approach very helpful in this world that you're navigating in? Because you were just talking about that the Kenyan government has also mandated the institutionalization of the last mile, right? So in this new world, right, because this is a question that is often faced in the minds of level entrepreneurs, right? Do I have to be in cahoots with the government in this kind of a new emerging world? Or would it even now, I've had people ask me this question of what will happen is one day when Reliance comes and takes over this open network initiative, right? So there are all of these set of questions that people tend to imagine when there are, either some kind of a crony capitalism or kind of way. So how have you sort of framed your idea and understanding of what is the role of government in this kind of a new world where you are operating within a certain constraints and within a certain guardrails here?
Great question, Vicky. I wish I had a direct answer to that. So fundamentally, it's all about an ambition of an entrepreneur. Now if you really look back and then see which network in this world, what is the largest farmer network anybody has? I really don't know what's right now at the each opal level, or maybe a 1 acre fund and 3 million.
Right now, government is the largest farmer network anywhere. They have the most massive infrastructure that anyone can imagine.
Exactly, correct. So it's a I don't want to use any wrong phrase here, but the point is, do you have a choice? If the ambition is to go and solve at a population scale, you have no choice but to work with the government. Now, having said that, there's a very clear, distinct difference between working with the government and working for the government. Now, working with the government is where, as an entrepreneur, I personally feel, yes, they are the custodians, they are the gatekeepers, and they are the owners. They have the power of pen. But how do you kind of influence that power, positively or negatively, is up to the ambition and what is it that we are really going after? Now, do you think the institutionalization would have happened just like that? In the last 1 year, we had 3 ministers of agriculture at state changing. 2 administrations have changed in this short period of time. Now, how do you ensure that the political will is sustained? And how do you ensure that this is, irrespective of whoever comes to power, this remains? You've got to have somebody constantly focused on this. And again, this relates to ambition. So, as I said, I wish I had a direct answer, but we consciously said that for us to be able to hit a population scale, you have no choice but to work with the government. And government, you got to understand their. But I think the narrative, which I remember 23 November is when I met this entire team of CDPI, Center for Digital Public Infrastructure. They hosted an Africa-wide, and I ended up traveling to Bangalore. And that's when I did the mistake of meeting this gentleman on the screen, Rajesh. he actually, I mean, he is the first guy who has answered like most of my questions. I'm like a super curious guy and have tons of questions. It's because it's a lonely place out here as an entrepreneur. One is you are out of your continent, you are completely in a new foreign land, and you want to make the change and see the change. And how do you do that? As entrepreneurs, sometimes we put a brave face and talk a lot of things at a big stage, but fundamentally, it's equally important to say what you don't know. And thanks to Rajesh, thanks to Sujit, and thanks to some of the people at the X-Step Foundation and the leadership team, they kind of gave a directional pathway. It's not prescription. And the directional pathway, 1+1, is where we started saying it can actually be not just 2, 4, but it can actually be 11. And for that kind of a leverage to happen, you need government on the table. So again, our ambition is to hit population scale. And what we are trying to do is to validate and do rapid experimentation at one country level so that we can bring the learnings out. And thanks to the initiatives where we're looking between Kenya, India, a lot of handshaking opportunities. So again, that's my take, Venki.
Sure, thank you. It makes a lot of sense that I keep telling many entrepreneurs, agri entrepreneurs that when I say agri entrepreneur, I'm talking about an agri-tech founder, not necessarily the agripreneur that you define. I tell them that governments are the biggest GTM scalers. You want to scale and big there because government has the kind of infrastructure that nobody can dream of. So
Exactly.
before you got disconnected, Rajesh, we were just talking about this whole question of, what is the role of government in this larger scheme of things? And, as generally entrepreneurs tend to develop cold feet and, when it comes to government getting more closer with government. And so that's where the question we were exploring with Sriram there. But we were having a chat in terms of, how do you see this sort of evolution, this role to sort of play in with the government working hand in hand with the private entity, and especially in a country like ours and in times like now, right? Today, Musk has much more power and is than probably like even Trump could even have, right? In terms of the kind of data and system that they have. So we are living in times when crony capitalism is considered looked at it much more critically there. So how do you sort of look at this, from your lens, and how do you sort of envisage this?
It's true. I mean, it's a fine line between crony capitalism and policy paralysis, right? I mean, it can work both ways. And we have often been at the end where both models don't necessarily work, which is basically this third path, right? I mean, like I said, the trick of making such kind of ecosystems work is how well curated or I mean, calibrated this entire experience is. And if any party tends to have a higher position in the hierarchy and so forth, they can basically run amok with it. That's so the government has a lot of positive. I mean, in our minds, we tend to place it now that we have a sense of clarity from say 10, 15 years of doing this, that a lot of the foundational instruments, maybe government is the biggest custodian or guarantor of some degree of quality or some degree of trust and so forth, right? Like uh, like the credentials of a actor, that I spoke about, right? Who in the country can provide that top level of trust against that particular person's credential or claims? Maybe it is the government, right? So perhaps trust the government to worry about the foundational layers. Private sector can contribute, but leave it to perhaps the government to actually take charge on that front. But the layer above, where once you have the foundational components like the payments or identity or trust and so forth and all, through which you create this big net, the idea of commercial transactions and commercial webs emerging where the market is the driver behind that particular change, right? There, if the government tries to step in, it sometimes slows down the whole process. It's the same argument, right? Like government shouldn't be in the business of doing business, basically. Step away from that. You have created the enabling environment, leave it to the businesses, have a role to play on multiple fronts, like this check and balance argument that we speak about. Help in framing policies in participation with the private sector representation so that we can do responsible business growth is still possible through these kind of ecosystems. Respect the necessary due reasons and credits of the civil society as such, the people involved, and so forth and all. So they have a lot of roles to play. It's just that they don't necessarily have to worry about, and perhaps even financing too. Like introduce these kind of financing instruments by which, if the idea is to encourage critical societal arguments like job growth and so forth, there's a lot of fillip that the government can do by opening up these kind of lines of credit for small enterprises, individual entrepreneurs, and so forth. And also, from that lens, a lot critical role for the government to play. It is just that it's not a pyramid where the government is sitting at the top. It has to be a table at the top where everybody has a seat on the table. How do you orchestrate that well is effectively the trick of every good DPI that has succeeded in the country, right? Aadhaar, getting people enrolled was what the government did very well. But what actually happened afterwards, the value of Aadhaar came through its authentication ecosystem, where businesses started using Aadhaar for their daily workflows and processes. And that basically brought down a lot of the friction within the society, right? That change can only be done by the private sector, largely, right? So there, if both are ready to tango well, then these kind of large-scale societal problems, there is a reason to believe that they can move towards resolution.
Very interesting.
Well said, Rajesh. Can I
Yes.
just comment, Venki, for a minute?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
So I was, I think, first time I'm listening to Rajesh, and always fascinates me, all these people. They just fascinate. He, then Sharad, then the other day I was listening to Vikram Garg, I think. He's from iSpirit Foundation. So to me, what impresses me about them is, and what I think we need to take forward in the deep is whatever they've evolved, they spent a decade plus in doing this, whether it is iSpirit or whether Step, where Rajesh, you're still with Step?
No, I'm with FIDE now.
FIDE, yeah.
Yeah.
Sujit and all. Yes, I know.
Yeah.
So I think what you have to understand is that there is a game of patience. That's something which, Venki, you're also aware of in the sphere of DP, which we are doing on agriculture. We are trying to do our bit from the TAC side. We're far away from. So to me, my inspiration I draw from iSpirit, from Step. And always Sharad tells me one thing. It's a 10, 15-year journey. Have patience. It's not going to happen in a hurry, right? So that's one thing I learned. And recently I was I was in ICAR and I was listening. Sharad was supposed to be there, he didn't come, then Vikram Garg came. And he gave a very simple presentation on India and citizen stack. So I still remember that. And I think what is stuck in my mind is empower Rajni, that lady in the core. Am I right, Rajesh? So that is stuck in my mind. And those three things are stuck in my mind, which is flow of people, flow of money, and flow of information. So I think some of those concepts are very strong and some of us need to absorb it. To me, I'm only intellectually connected with it, but I need to connect with it in spirit. So what does it mean? So I think I need to perhaps spend a bit more time with people like Rajesh and Sharad and all to imbibe it, and then perhaps try and put those principles and values in what we are trying to do in the Agri Collaborative. We are far away from all this, so we still need to do that. So they are the inspiration. Rajesh, you people are all the inspiration. And of course, what this guy Sriram does in Kenya single-handedly is another thing. Are you still there or are you going to shift to Bangalore, buddy? Where are you?
I'm still in Kenya, Sanjeev.
Okay. So I look forward to meeting both. I have not met you physically, any of you, other than Venki. So I'm sorry, Venki, you're the only person I met so far in this. So I couldn't resist coming in with a saw the word deep.
Added a lot of aspects of his journey. So he has had a very interesting journey, and I think I see him being there in this situated in Africa much more longer run. Yeah.
So I think one slide which you must see, Venki, I must share it with you, is on the design principles for societal platforms, which I picked up, which are very powerful as to what are the principles. So that is something which we need to absorb. Keep that as the lodestar. Keep that every morning like a prayer. Look at that and then approach. Those we tend to get digress very easily. So this is something which they have evolved. That's something which you need to understand. And if you keep the overall objective very clear and keep the personalities out. And I think, I'm sorry for changing the tack, but I like what Sriram also said. So in my various initiatives that I've done in public-private partnership, when I was the head of Agri, I have succeeded only because the government is there. Most of the initiatives of ITC, whether it is CSR or whatever, scale only is provided by the government. You have to enable them. You have to enable them. And believe me, it takes a bit of effort, but once you enable it, they can take it forward far better. You'll be surprised with the power and the scale and the scope which the government can bring in. None of us can manage it. No organization, even Reliance, cannot match it.
Thank you. Thank you for those insights. It's a it's a journey for Bichopal, and internalizing it has led to a lot of interesting, spawned a lot of progenies in many, many ways. And I think, what you were sharing was also earlier.
So I got a wedding happening in the family.
Sure.
So I want to log off. Hi, Rajeesh. Hi,
you have a more complex coordination problem there. So good luck with that.
You're surprised what I'm doing. I'm just doing taxi planning, Baba. You just come and see what I'm doing. Grassroots level work right now. Okay?
No problem. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
So now that we have almost an hour there, and we'll open up the floor. So Vivek, some good friends are here. Vivek, Madhav, Kushang, Tarun, anybody want to ask questions, we can chime in. While you guys open up, I'll maybe also throw in one more question here. Right? One of the challenges that I'm seeing right now, right, in the context of building specifically the unified Krishi interface, is the fact that to use this DPI and the beacon world, right, we have more people willing to sign up as BPPs rather than BAPs. Because as everybody wants to serve farmers, and so very few are ready to actually build the networks, right? Where people, there are two ways. Just for the context of everyone else, there are two ways, right? One is you either build a BPP where you are sort of focusing on what your supply is, or you do a BAP where you focus on the demand. But right now, interestingly, what I'm noticing is everybody wants to be at the supply end because that's where they can make money, right? Because at the demand end, it's going to take time until these commercial models are built in. So it seems like a lot of this, and I was checking with these people around there, and it seemed like it was a problem that's only specific to agri, because in everyone else, there are a lot more BAPs and coming in. So I wonder if that's a pattern that you're seeing in elsewhere and in the evolution of these networks.
So in fact, it's the contrary, right? So even in ONDC and so forth, what's actually happening is on the consumer end, the BAP end, there's consolidation happening, right? So it's largely boiling down to a few platforms that people trust, right? Supplier side, there's a huge variety of supplier platforms and all, but on the consumer, it's because people don't want to switch across platforms. People want a unifying experience. They like some of the efforts that we have done recently is to basically simulate how a person, like a farmer. Now, farmer is a farmer by profession, but a farmer is also a health beneficiary. A farmer is also a social security aspirant, and so forth and all. How do you create all these unifying different experiences for the farmer? The farmer shouldn't be asked to get into three separate BAPs to transact, right? So, which is the reason why a degree of consolidation is actually happening. There are some of these super apps emerging now, the likes of Paytm and etc., who want to cater to this multi-sectoral personal journey of the user per se or the consumer per se. So from that lens, it is more convenience. It's more, the idea of the network is to provide choice. So once the choice is brought in front of the consumer platform, the platform knows how to personalize it well. And the platform will make it multi-sectoral. So there it will be a game of who provides the best experience, right? It can be omni-channel, it could be a bot layer with only voice and so forth and all. Whoever provides the best experience will remain, and which is perfectly okay as an expectation setting also, right? But what you'd probably see, like the agripreneurs that Sriram spoke about, at the end of the day, there is a limited pool of agripreneurs, right? You don't want them to be straddling between many apps, or bots and etc. Give them a trusted toolkit through which they can operate and engage with their farmers. It may not be the farmers dealing with that device. Now that could be like one BAP. Does not matter, right? As long as the power of the network and all commodities and knowledge sets and everything is made available on that device of that agriculture. Supply side is a different argument altogether because there we want diversity, right? Even the smallest player in town should have a digital representation. How do they come on board is the question, right? So can there be platforms through which they come independently, or do they join hands and come through these multi-provider marketplace products and so forth and all? I mean, there are these products who assimilate several such small scale suppliers together. That's their choice, but keep it wide enough so that everybody can be represented, everybody can open up their catalogs, and through their assets or catalogs being visible to the consumer sites users, their chances of transacting go up. That's basically the argument. So experience and convenience on the demand side, diversity and more visibility on the provider side. So that's
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Any questions from Vivek, Tarun, Kushang, Madhav? Anybody anything want to bring it up? Yeah, Tarun.
Hi Rajesh. Hi Sriram. Great discussion. Uh, so I think I've been a big believer in DPIs since I got to know about iSpirit, a couple of years back. And like I had two questions, one around agri DPI and one is like generic DPI. So around the agri DPI, my question is like there are a lot of efforts which are going on parallelly around agri DPI, right? There is AgriStack, there is Unified Krishi, there is TSC also is trying to build something around that. So how do you foresee like all of these coming together eventually? Do you think they will complement each other, or will there be overlap between them? Uh, Especially around agri, because agri is also like a lot of it has a lot of depth and a lot of width, right? So will there be like stacks which will cover depths, and will there be stacks which will cover width, and they will kind of seamlessly integrate with each other? So how do you foresee like the future of multiple stacks coming in around agri? The second question is around, so can I go with my second question, or shall I? Okay. The second question is like, Rajesh, from your experience, like you mentioned about different sectors, right? So, do you have any learnings around like which sectors adopts DPIs better? Are there any insights around that, like basically? So yeah.
Yeah, okay. Should I take that or?
Yeah, anybody? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think the first question about several uh, ag DPI efforts underway in India. I'm presuming this question is specific to India, right? No, I actually think it's a good emergent scenario, right? It always Why have a single point of failure where it's basically like one single program where and everybody's trying to assimilate around it? My entire belief system has been, I mean, which is the reason why I actually support UKI very closely, because I like the idea of uh, micro DPI missions emerging across the country, right? Because the whole point is agriculture as a subject in itself is decentralized, right? The needs and wants are very different across regions. The behavioral patterns and the consumer profiles are also very different. Supplier access is also very different. You can't necessarily control this from Delhi, right? So an argument that, in fact, last year when I met Venki and others was on this front was like, why can't we imagine something like a large agriculture grid in India, much like how the power grid works, but with several agri pods on the ground, right? Every pod in itself is a DPI manifestation. You'd end up doing the same thing, right? The pod has integrations with the agri stack. The pod has integrations with ONDC for market access. The pods have solved for their internal access and uh, uh, trust requirements too. There is a local community there on the farmer side as well as the supplier side. There are commercial transactions happening over there. And there is enough autonomy where nothing is being controlled by somebody else beyond the orchestrators of the pod on the ground. Now, this I believe, at least for, I mean, generally my own sense of how the DPI evolution will take place is it'll actually get more and more decentralized like this, especially specifically for sectors which are not necessarily national instruments, right? Agriculture, health, or tourism, and these are all local subjects. How well can you decentralize these models is the trick to actually making it work. Well, while you do that, a pod, I mean, imagine this, like a pod is nothing but like a node on a larger network, right? You still need the bigger grid to come into existence. And that's where uh, several actors like the national government can play a role. The government can just sit back and say, let me try and frame the guardrails of what this national grid should look like with valuable contributions from the private sector and research and etc. But let me allow the space for operations to completely decentralized actors. Now, that's the role of the markets. I mean, and a good manifestation of that could be UKI when it actually scales up, right? You may have the agri stack. You may have a UKI working with the agri stack for solving for trust and identity and so forth. You may have UKI integrating with ONDC because it gives in a much wider market access beyond the region in itself. But then you probably have all of this beautifully working together because of a few common elements, maybe a few national policies which allow for agriculture information flow within the country, a bunch of unifying protocols, again, so that information flow is not stuck on proprietary uh, interfaces and so forth, But if you have these common elements and all baked in, then you're looking at a scenario where several such decentralized pods or nodes will exist in a much larger national grid per se, right? That's the imagination that we're going after. So the government is doing its bit on scaling up AgriStack and Krishi DSS and etc. Uh, we are trying to encourage more and more private sector led agri pod networks on the ground, like UKI and etc. And hopefully, and while we do this, we are also keeping the balance in play so that this integration argument is thought of from the very beginning, right? We started by thinking we need to work with AgriStack and ONDC and others and etc. Right? So it becomes a seamless journey once all of these missions scale up.
But
So,
Rajesh, can I push back a little bit on this point a little bit
yeah,
though? Because
yeah,
it's something which I wanted to bring into our conversation, but couldn't get into right time. See,
yeah,
at one level, if I really wear a cynical hat, uh, it becomes a question of, are we becoming unwilling guinea pigs for Indian agriculture to become furthermore centralized? Right? Because in many ways, if you really see, look at the, I mean, I'm not just saying this without any whim here, but if you really look at it at one level, the constitution structures itself is getting a little more centralized, right? In
yeah,
terms of what is the structures that we are having. And at the same time, we are also now observing over a period of time that, in agri, there is a central moot problem has always been the struggle between the center and the state, right? We saw this in the farm laws. The center tried to update the farm laws. Every state immediately responded and quickly changed their farm laws so that center cannot exert their power and on state. So in this kind of a battle that's going on between center and state, how do you think DPIs are responding in that kind of environment? Do you think that this will enable with this kind of a decentralized grid that you're talking about, will this be dominant by a more centralizing entity, especially with Krishi TSs of the kind where they can exert more centralizing power on the states? Or do you think the private individual states can still retain the federal structure? Because agriculture is a state subject at the end of the day.
of
Right?
course.
Only state governments can have the budgets there. The governments only can, in fact, the governments pay very less to the central when compared to the percentage of the state wise.
Yeah, no, I think the argument is for having equal participation from the state front also. Uh, See, some of these initiatives are in its early days. We still haven't seen the full manifestation of AgriStack nor Krishi DSS. These are experiments in motion, right? They put forth a value argument. Like AgriStack says, I will solve for identity and trust, right? And in the same way with Krishi DSS. That does not necessarily mean that these would actually get enforced upon state programs and so forth and all. I mean, I personally saw this when we were trying to do Vistar last year, right? States have their own ideas of what a Vistar could be. right? They want their own information networks within the state, right? They don't necessarily seem to think that the knowledge resources or access beyond what the local communities need is needed within that network in itself. Like I've been saying, right, most of the farmer requests that came from the ground for this kind of an information access was more about, can I peer learn from others? Not like what the central research institutes have to say and so forth and all. Right. So from there was enough of a pushback. So what the center basically ended up doing is that the center said, at least for the central institutions and so forth, I will create my own micro network as such, and I'll open up access to that network to every other state, right? It's up to the state if they want to tap into those resources. What the center also have been trying to do is to invite the states to say, let's think of a common governance model as such for imagining this kind of a grid, right? Because what we would like to see is, if there are few states who want this information flow to happen between central institutions and state institutions and so forth and all, how do we do it without barriers? So, which is why the idea of unifying protocols or some kind of a multi-party governance structure and so forth and all. So, you create those instruments through which collaboration is possible, but never really enforced upon a state. It's entirely up to the state's interest. Like UP, Uttar Pradesh government is basically creating their own network now, right? It's not like the center has much of a role to play there. The center is also contributing because the center's assets like AgriStack will be used within that state's network, and they see value in using that. So the choice is up to the state, or even more further below, localized setups to actually define how they want to use the national assets. But beyond that, I'm at least optimistic that it won't result in a centrally driven structure as such, because that is doomed to fail, right? So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Kushan.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful discussion. I am a PhD student from University of Auckland, looking at the emerging agtech sector in the country, and I was uh, curious about the question of DPI, but from the farmer's perspective per se. Uh, since you've also worked in African countries, I also want to understand how much awareness do farmers, especially smallholder farmers, have when it comes to the data emanating from their farms, right? Because many of these, like AgriStack, for instance, has the unified farmer service interface, right? Which has this structure which allows farmers to give consent whenever, let's say, a company wants to access the data from their farm, right? But my question is, are farmers do are and I want to learn about this, and that's why I'm asking. Uh, do farmers Are farmers even aware about this? And secondly, related to that is my question about the 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 data governance models, right? Um, can we create DPIs which uh, create more farmer-centric governance models, which actually allows them, if not individually but collectively, let's say, give consent to where that their data is going in that sense? Yeah, thank you.
Any of you want to take a question?
Okay. Do you want to take this, Sriram?
Yeah, so it's a mixed bag, Kushan, to be very honest. Farmers, for them, this is, at least the ones that we are dealing with in the African context, they really have no idea right now. But what I think the responsibility some of the institutions like us are taking upon ourselves is to make them aware of what is happening. And this is where the governance and the data structures and the data protection policies and principles are coming into effect. And for example, in Kenya, we have something called a Data Protection Act. The institutions like us who are operating with the farmers and the communities have to necessarily go and get a status of a data controller or data processor. So it is best done by kind of putting this kind of a policies for those who are dealing with the farmers to have the checks and balances than directly going all the way to the farmer level. For them, this is yet another confusion point. Now, by bringing that into that act into place and also putting some stringent controls there is how some of the countries in Eastern Africa are able to manage. But I think this is still a journey, and a lot of maturity has to emerge. And the beauty of it is at least the conversations like this are happening regularly in different forums. And my sense is in the next year or so, we should have more clarity coming in.
So just to add to Sriram's point, Kushang, you may want to study Karnataka's experiments with fruits and e-Paramati, where a farmer consent management platform has already been designed, where farmer data can be shared. This webinar happened with the Karnataka government, and I happened to attend that webinar. And I've actually, if you dig into agribusiness matters, you can dig up the notes of what I've studied there. So there is an attempt. But just consent management hasn't evolved to a state of paying farmers and connecting that. So, but Karnataka has made the initial steps on consent management from a data perspective with farmers there. So it may be worthwhile studying that in detail. Thanks. Any last questions?
Rajesh, do you want to take the other question which I asked? If you want to share,
Yes. Which ones? Okay. No, so like I said, like I'd probably break it down into from the lens of foundational versus transactional, right? And that's how I try to simplify what a societal DPI differs from a market-oriented DPI, right? End of the day, they're both digital infrastructure or digital highways per se. Which sectors have actually picked it up? I mean, to be fair, our experience, the idea of DPI came into existence because we wanted to streamline monetary flows. We wanted to make sure that social security is addressed, right? The genesis or reason behind Aadhaar was to actually look into the welfare instruments that we actually had within the country, right? And there was a lot of pilferage and leakage and so forth and all. So from that lens, it actually worked out very well there, right? I mean, you know the Jandan story and all of that. It transformed all of that, and then subsequently building on that, the payment infrastructure, which was another experiment that went well. A lot of them worked because there were like strong custodians or regulators also involved. And as all of us basically spoke about, like there's no bigger scaler than the government in the country. So they actually helped in taking these ideas forward. Subsequently, some of the sectoral DPI efforts have not necessarily scaled dramatically, right? We've had, for instance, an agri stack F. I mean, I don't know what it was called before, but it was probably called the idea stack or something, like even years before agri stack, right?
Yeah.
We've had the health stack and several other stacks. Some of those, their adoptions haven't been great, right? Largely because the foundational components of these stacks, like having registries at the center for actors, organizations, and so forth, their enrollments have seen traction because it's again like this carrot and the stick, like the government basically saying everybody should enroll here, right? So professionals, if you want a valid medical license, be part of this, right? Then your opportunity net is widening and so forth and all. So those foundational blocks like registries and etc., where the government had the writ, they saw adoption. But some of the components like consent, anonymizer, and so forth and all, these things were largely relevant in a market-led interaction, which is where in open networks, when you see market interactions actually happening, you suddenly find the idea of consent being important, right? I want to transact with this requesting party, but I want it to be done with consent baked in, right? those have not really penetrated well enough because the private sector hasn't fully embraced what those building blocks could do from the lens of DPI. That is more, I think that's more an asymmetry in terms of the private sector's understanding of what those building blocks could do. They've not fully turned in onto those health or agri DPI efforts as such. I think it's a matter of time. The more value that they see from these foundational building blocks, they will start accommodating them in their own native workflows and so forth and all. But uh, which is why, if you see in the last couple of years, the idea of market-led open networks and not necessarily government-led. Market-led open networks is basically where we are trying to put for the same building blocks, but now baked into the procedures of what these open networks are supposed to do, right? It becomes part of the governance framework of such networks too. So tomorrow, UKI, if you want to encourage information flow, because we don't need any other uh, entity from which you need to take permission per se and etc. Let's introduce digital consent as a core enabler within these interactions. So it gives us the opportunity, and the consent artifact would have been defined by the government per se. So in a way, the market missions on the ground are basically using instruments which the government had a role in creating, right? That's basically, in a way, what we are seeing at. And I mean, I don't know, like what, I mean, my own personal sense is sectors which have seen a good degree of formalization, like commerce, logistics to a degree, and so forth and all, or mobility, because in there the data sets are fairly standardized. It's easier to transact and ride on DPI faster. Health, agriculture, and so forth, where the data in itself is extremely diverse, largely unregulated or standardized, and has variable nomenclature variations across the country and etc. Extremely hard to solve through DPI right now, but it's a process in motion, right? So, yeah, I mean, I would put it that way. Market facing sectors tend to see value faster, right?
Yeah, and you're also pushing the boundary further by also getting into your one tack with the culture level. So I think it's
Yeah.
a great
It's really
experiment.
hard.
We talk about that sometime. Yes, Vivek.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this. There's a one question that I wanted to ask is, with all the DPI efforts, is the ground truthing of data or the collection of data has to be as in human led, or are you also looking to buy data from businesses like the big input companies that have farmer records or FPO databases, or it's only government and collection by other humans agent or the entrepreneurs like Sriram mentioned in Kenya? It's open to both of you. Like, what is the general sense in terms of
Are you saying, is
collecting
there
the
a
data?
model for collecting of data and buying data within this framework you're saying?
Yeah.
So, Venki, can I
Please,
take?
please.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Vivek. I think it's very clearly there is a give and get relationship between all the ecosystem actors. Yeah, the best scenario is somebody has a ready-made data and we can bring in, or there's no single answer to this, right? So when we bring these ecosystem actors together onto a common mission or a network, every interaction between two players or multiple players or any transaction between two players is generating a set of data. So what we're also doing is, again, speaking from our own experience, at a foundational level, we are bringing a set of data sets. We call it farmer registry or this registry or weather registry. Some are paid, some are rented, and some are ground truthed. But ongoing interactions is the one that would drive and propel this kind of data engine, because that's a combination of what is happening on the system and what is happening between few actors. And that's where the common infrastructure, the digital public infrastructure, would be the engine that is churning the data. And yes, it's a different challenge as to how do I now make sense out of the data and other things that are opportunities again for innovation to thrive. But so fundamentally, that's the way we are at least seeing this happening.
Correct. Thank you.
Super. I think this is a very, very fascinating conversation. I am seeing that I'm left with a lot more optimism now about DPI networks. I almost came in with the burden of a lot of the, what is happening on the ground, what are the challenges that I'm grappling with in the in my builder's hat, and also from the sense of what is happening in. But I'm now seeing a lot more clarity in terms of the way things are moving forward, provided, as you said, provided this orchestration and careful curation and coordination of these players. I think that's where the real challenge is. So thank you, gentlemen, for taking the time to speak to us. And Sriram, really enjoyed your insights. Hoping that Africa is always riddled with a lot of the challenges, and any conversation on Africa and scaling and future gets get into the territory of the West wants Africa to be poor. So hoping that we create some newer narratives and that can disrupt some of these existing narratives and create a lot more positive stories of impact. On that note, thank you very, very much. Thank you for spending the time to speak with us.
Thank you again. Thanks, Rajesh. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody. Nice
Bye.
to meet you. Bye.